If you know me, you know that I absolutely love the work of artists like John Singer Sargent. But Sargent isn't the only incredible painter that I want to learn from. So while you've seen me make a lot of videos where I am learning directly from Sargent's work through things like master copy, I want to branch out a little bit today. So if you want to learn to create painterly portraits in the style of these incredible painters, like not just Sargent, but also like Anders Zorn, Cecilia Beaux, Joaquín Sorolla, stick around because I'm going to be embarking on a little project to branch out and show you my journey of how I learn to pull off master copies of these pieces and then turn them into original paintings that are in my style so that you can do the same. So diving in, I've studied a lot of Sargent paintings in the past. I need to figure out if I'm going to branch out and I'm going to learn from a painter like Anders Zorn or Cecilia Beaux, I need to look at some of their work. So I've gone ahead and done a little bit of research through my Pinterest board, actually. For those of you who've been following my channel for a while, you will have heard me talk about creating vision boards for your artwork on Pinterest a lot of the time. That being said, if you're new here, first of all, welcome. I'll go ahead and put a link above to some of those Pinterest videos in case you have not watched them before or you want a little bit of a refresher. But essentially, if I go over to my Pinterest vision board, and I go to the section on portraits, I have quite a few paintings here. A number of them are Sargent paintings or paintings by contemporary painters who list Sargent as an influence, but Sargent is certainly not the only painter we see here. So for today, I wanted to take a look at some Zorn pieces, and I also wanted to take a look at a Cecilia Beaux piece. So I've gone ahead and I've pulled a couple of these paintings out. So first we see this Cecilia Beaux piece, and then this Anders Zorn piece. I pulled both of these off of Wikimedia Commons, which for pieces in the public domain, this is a really great resource for finding high quality reproductions of these paintings to study from. They also give me some additional information that's really useful. So for instance, I can see that this Cecilia Beaux painting is about 34.5 by 48 inches. And similarly, this Anders Zorn painting is 53 inches by 39.5 inches. So if I were to do a full scale reproduction of these images, this is how I would actually know what size to work at. So right now, I feel pretty torn between studying these two images. I think both have a lot that they can teach me. First, I want to walk you through, though, what it is that draws me to these paintings in particular. So first things first, both of these capture a really stunning likeness in a way that I would say incorporates really beautiful brushwork. And in actually achieving that likeness, I don't see any signs of the artist overworking or over tightening the painting. So we have a lot of clarity here in the face. I don't see much in the way of overworked paint, but what I love about this painting so much actually is what happens when I scroll down to the hands and the hat here. I especially love this hat. I think it's beautiful. I would honestly do a study of just this hat, probably, because it is done so simply. I could probably count the brush strokes necessary to create something like this, and I would say the hands are a pretty nice extension of that too. Then going over to the Cecilia Beaux painting, I love just how painterly this entire suit looks. I love that I can see every brush stroke here. I love how wet the paint looks. I love the creamy colors and the interesting dynamic between these very creamy yellows and then these pops of purple and the shadow shapes of this particular jacket. I think it's really gorgeous. And then of course the fact that we have the colors going essentially to green in a lot of these shadows, it's really, really stunning. Interestingly, what I think draws me to both of these paintings has more to do with the garments than the actual portraits themselves. I would say the hands might be a little bit of an extension of that too. I am certainly not someone who will willingly choose to paint hands if you leave me to my own devices, but I really, really love the hands in both of these paintings here. And I especially love the way that the garments were painted. So this kind of brings me to how am I going to actually decide which of these two pieces to paint? I've already talked a little bit about the size of both of these, and frankly, both of these paintings are very large. They're larger than I typically paint. So I essentially need to make a decision. Am I going to scale these down? Am I going to crop them in? Or am I going to actually go for a full scale portrait on these? And to be honest, I don't have a super decisive answer to that question. So I thought it'd be nice to actually walk you through what the thought process looks like. To help me actually work through this, I'm going to just spend some time with these paintings. This is something that I would really recommend that you do anytime that you are wanting to really study or learn from a piece, regardless of who you're learning from. It doesn't have to be someone like Sargent or Beaux or Zorn. One of the first things I want to look at as I actually scroll through this painting are what are the passages that I find really beautiful in here. So I would say a lot of my interest in this piece happens right in this area. I love how the jacket has been handled and just how many lost edges there are. I love how decisive and clear the brushwork is. I think the color choices here are really stunning. Moving up to the portrait, I see a lot of these little color notes echoed. We see this little tiny hint of purple up here. We see pops of pink as we transition from kind of this local skin color to some of the core shadow shapes. We see little places where we move from beige to pink in the forehead. And of course, we see these really hot pops of color in areas like the nostril, the very edge of this core shadow, and the ears as well. So there's a lot going for this piece already. I'm going to talk about what I find intimidating or what may be logistically challenging about studying this piece next, because I think that's an important consideration as well. So first things first, the size of this. I don't think I've ever completed a painting at this size, at least not a portrait. So that would definitely be a real logistical concern for a piece like this. Now, backing up a little bit, the background of this painting isn't super complex. This might be something that as I look at it, I could probably knock out inside of a sitting. I think it would really be the hand, the cat, the suit jacket, and the face that would take more time. And if I think about those just in terms of the raw amount of real estate that they would take up on a panel, it actually would be significantly less. In fact, I can effectively run a calculation, even though I've never seen this painting in person, to determine what would the size of just the head be painted at and how does that compare to some of the portraits I've made before. That could give me a really solid idea of about how much time it would take to study just this part of the piece. Now, I don't have an equivalent for something like the jacket, so that's going to be a little bit tough, but I could potentially look at something like the cat and look at some pet portraits that I've made before, and again extrapolate out the size, think about the complexity, and give myself essentially a rough amount of time that I think that it would take to complete this piece. Now, you might be wondering why I'm thinking this much about timing. And I'll be frank with you, a lot of it has to do with the fact that I do put these on YouTube and I have a production schedule. But another really important consideration here is the fact that I don't want my paint to dry if it's not meant to dry. So if I need to work on a section like this suit, for instance, and I need to be working wet into wet, I need to actually make sure that I can successfully make all the brush strokes on that area that I need to while the paint is still wet, if that is what, actually makes sense for that piece. So this brings me to the next thing that I'm sure you are wondering, because I have a lot of students that I work with ask me this same question. How do I actually know what was done wet into wet, or what kind of techniques were necessary to create these kinds of marks? This is something where experience makes a huge difference. I have spent a lot of time studying paintings, doing master copies of paintings, and creating my own paintings. And so what that means is that when I look at a painting like this one, I have a real advantage because I've made a lot of these kinds of marks before. And I essentially have this internal database of what marks look like when the surface is dry, but the paint's really wet, what it looks like when the paint is wet and thin, put on top of other wet and thin paint, what it looks like when the paint is thicker on either layer, etc. If this is something that you're interested in doing, if you want to be able to learn from your favorite painters and then successfully pull off their techniques in your own paintings, but you're getting stumped on this step of like really understanding what techniques are necessary, this is what I specialize in. So if you do want this help on your journey to be able to level up your loose portraiture, there's a link down in the description to reach out to book a call to see if we're a fit to work together. I would love to chat with you and find out more about your painting goals. Back to this painting though. I'm gonna actually go ahead and walk you through some of the things that I'm seeing to give you a sense of what's really gonna be necessary on this piece. So first things first, I'm gonna start with something pretty simple, and that is the background. One thing I notice when I take a look at the background around the subject's face here is that I see a lot of transparency, or the linen texture underneath the painting coming through. I can see that in some of these passages here. It takes the form of these sort of warm, creamy dots that are punctuating this almost like minty green gray wash that's put down here. I can see it in some of the brush strokes. I can also see it in some of the dry brush marks right here. And especially areas where I actually just see what looks like raw canvas showing through, that is really helpful. It's also noteworthy that I don't see any evidence of impasto here. So I don't see any shadows or highlights that are being created just from the thickness of the paint. So this tells me that these passages of the background were probably laid in fairly thinly. And there's some other considerations that I'm gonna focus on here as well. So one thing that I really like to look for are areas where the paint seems to be interacting with other paint strokes. This is a great example right here. We can see that this probably happened actually in a couple of brush strokes. We can see this kind of blunted, fairly neat edge of this darker green right here. And then we see this sort of raw feathered edge that reaches up from it. This tells me a couple of things right off the bat. One, the fact that I see the paint actually blending together here tells me that this darker paint stroke was created when this underlying background color was still wet. That is what actually allows them to have that blending effect. Next, this was done in 2 brush strokes. The one on the left was probably done with the brush stroke starting here and then going down. And then the one on the right probably started somewhere lower and worked up. This kind of blending typically happens as you lift the brush off the canvas at the end of a brush stroke. Now, one other mark that I want to point out is something like a dry brush mark, which is what we see right here. This is something where I don't actually see paint blending or changing value or color or saturation as the brushstroke interacts with what's underneath it. Typically, we only see a change in texture. So the fact that I see these little dots of paint on top of what looks like the bare linen canvas tells me that that was probably bare canvas for one versus white paint, and that it was probably pretty dry in order to get that kind of scumbled dry brush effect. So putting all of this together, I essentially will go around the painting looking for these kinds of marks. I will look for areas like this one where I can actually see, again, the paint is very thin, and interestingly, there's some evidence of layering here. Moving over to where the pants essentially meet with the seat of the chair, there's a little bit of running, which tells me this is probably painted with some kind of lean medium. And that paint and medium mixture or paint and solvent mixture is actually streaking down. The fact that it's really cleanly interrupted here tells me that this black was probably painted on top of that area to create a crisp edge. And I will effectively go and do that analysis all throughout the entire painting until I have a basic sense of what was the order in which this painting had to come to life in. Now, this is really tricky with a big painting. It's why when I have my students do an exercise like this one, I usually suggest that they actually crop in to a particular section of the painting they want to study, because there are fewer layers and fewer elements that they have to keep track of as far as the order in which it goes down. So let's take a look at that specifically with the face in mind. One thing I noticed right off the bat here is that I can see from the grain of this background brushstroke that this stroke was made essentially straight up and down. But what's interesting is that I don't see any evidence of the brushstroke ending here. In fact, I think if this mark were made pretty naturally, like if I were to try and make this mark, the mark probably extended somewhere well down into his head, but it's cut off really neatly by this gray streak that is the highlight on the hair right there. What this tells me is that this mark was made before these dark areas of the hair were actually laid in. Interestingly, as I look at the left side, I do subtly see some indications of the background being painted up to the hairline here. So that's not to say that Cecilia Beaux painted the entire piece with the background in first and then she just progressed forward into the portrait. Chances are there was some background work, then some of the portrait was established, and then we had some background layers that probably came in over top. Based on what I see here, it looks like there was an underpainting on the background that's probably closer to what we see right here. We can see that bleed through just on the side of the temple here. And then this darker, like hunter green color probably actually came in after a lot of the face was painted. But again, this edge was probably tidied up with these marks that represent the highlights on the hair. And we can see a little bit of evidence of this just in this highlight on the top of the head and the fact that it does interact just a little bit with some of that background paint color. So if I were to do a study of just the face here, I would probably lay in an overall background wash. It wouldn't get as opaque and as dark as this hunter green, but it would establish like a base tone. I would probably lay in a lot of the portrait, and then I would probably go back in and clean up some of this background and lay in this more opaque hunter green just before I clean up and darken some areas of the hair. So you can see just from this one example that this gives us essentially like an order of operations for going about a master copy like this one. And these are the kinds of things that I'm thinking about in my own painting, especially when I'm doing something like studies. But I do think about it when I'm creating original works as well. I just have to be a little bit less of a detective trying to reverse engineer a painting. And instead, I can essentially plan from the beginning what would I really like to go down first and what are some of the advantages and disadvantages of laying the paint down in that order. That being said, a lot of you wind up studying artists specifically because you want to better understand how do I achieve this kind of brushwork. And a lot of this kind of brushwork requires that some areas of the paint might already be dry, some areas might be raw canvas, some areas might be covered in wet paint. So many of the textures and interactions and brushstrokes are really contingent upon that. So when you're actually in this act of trying to learn how to, replicate this for yourself and use these tools for your own original pieces, it does help to go the extra mile to take this step and actually reverse engineer the image thoughtfully and come away with a really clear plan of attack for your own painting. Okay, so now I've gone through some of the considerations for painting a piece like this one, focusing primarily on the face and the background for right now, just to keep things simple. So how does this compare with this Anders Zorn painting? Let me go ahead and zoom back out. So again, first things first, I want to really spend some time looking at this painting and taking in and really admitting to myself what it is that I'm drawn to about this painting and what I would want to study. So one thing I noticed right off the bat in this piece is just how dry a lot of this looks. And this is a little bit tricky. I see a lot of evidence of dry brush marks all over the background of this piece. That's not to say I don't see areas where I see wet paint working into wet paint, but it seems that either this canvas is so large that you would require a lot of medium to get a lot of the creaminess in the paint that you can enjoy on a smaller canvas. That just has to do with the distance the paint has to be able to smoothly travel. It's also possible that this painting has been cleaned and some of the paint like lifted off or was skinned off in cleaning. If you watch Bumgarner restoration videos, you probably know exactly what I'm talking about. That being said, I'm not an expert in that area. That's just kind of one thought I have as to a consideration that I might keep in mind. But on this particular painting, the fact that so much of this looks to be actual dry brush marks, not areas that actually were wetter, juicier marks that were just aggressively cleaned, I'm inclined to say that no, this painting hasn't been cleaned. It probably just has a lot of this dry brush texture because of the size of the piece, and maybe the relative viscosity of the paint. So on this particular painting, overall, I would say there's a little bit less of a wet look. And right away, that's going to be something for me to keep in mind. For a very long time, I was really drawn to very wet painting. Like the juicier looking, the better. So thinking about painters like Richard Schmid or Daniel Keyes, I just loved the brushstrokes in their work and the impasto and texture in the paint that they achieved. And then I got really turned on to Carolyn Anderson's work, who has, I would say, a much drier approach overall. It's not to say that there aren't really wet, gorgeous, juicy brushstrokes in her work, but overall, in order for me to try and move elements of her work into what I do, I did have to learn how to paint much drier than I have before. But taking a look at this on the whole, a painting like this one and just the sheer amount of dryness in here, I think right off the bat, it makes me just maybe a little bit less drawn to this particular piece. Interestingly, a lot of this background, you can see it's done very simply, but other than like an area like this one where you can actually see a lot of the linen texture coming through and you can see these kind of characteristic changes in color that happen based on that texture, this tells me that the paint was probably applied fairly thinly and translucently. I can see a little bit of evidence in this brushstroke too of something similar, but overall, a lot of these brushstrokes look really opaque. Take some of these black passages, for instance, some of these like transparent oxide red or kind of olive green passages here. They definitely build up more and more opacity. This is especially true of like these gray areas of the frame that is in the background of this piece. So I would say just based on this paint texture alone, I'm a little bit less drawn to this background. That's not to say I don't love it though, but I'm actually having to actively choose between these two paintings right now. So I wanted to give you a little bit of insight into that thought process. One thing that really strikes me though is just how much dryness there is in the face itself. Now, one thing I will quickly note, part of the reason why it is so helpful to have a very high resolution reference you're working off of when you're actually learning from a painting that you love in the form of completing a master copy, it's really helpful to make sure that you aren't getting any kind of JPEG artifacts or noise in the image. This is a pretty good image. That being said, for something as detailed as the face, I might like to see a close-up of this just so that I can see with a little bit more clarity exactly what the paint texture looks like. Because one thing that really stands out to me is just how much grain I see coming through in areas like the hair. I do see areas where it looks like there's wet paint being applied into wet paint, for example, this cheek. But I am really surprised by just how much of this kind of dry brush texture I'm getting in the face itself. I think in things like hair, it actually makes sense to go drier. It kind of naturally simulates the optical illusion that hair creates. But I am a little bit surprised by just how dry some of the face itself is. I think that's another thing that maybe makes me a little bit uncomfortable about studying this piece. This might be something that I have to experiment a little bit more with and work my way up to, just because when I think about paintings that I've studied before, I don't know whether I've had something that has a dry brush texture that is quite this uniform throughout the entire face. I might have to kind of sit with this a little bit more and give myself time to better study it and understand it before I dive into something like this. Interestingly, when I look at something like the jacket, this is one of the only areas that makes me wonder if perhaps this painting has been like mildly skinned while it was cleaned. Again, I like shudder the thought that Julian Baumgartner is watching this video and like looking at my analysis and thinking, no, you're absolutely wrong. Shout out to you, Julian, if for whatever reason you're watching my YouTube channel. But the only thing that makes me like even ask this question is like this area right here. It's almost like there's kind of this halo of patchiness in the paint. And it actually goes from like the chest area of this jacket a bit into the arm. And so it almost looks like, you know, if you actually rubbed away a paint layer in kind of a circular motion versus it following a very clear brushstroke-like pattern. Because all in all, when I look at this jacket, I see pretty opaque paint and I see paint that's being worked wet into wet to get these very subtle nuances of the folds and the creases and subtle highlights on this suit. But then we come to the section of the painting that for me is most interesting and most exciting, the thing that makes me want to study it. And that would be the hands plus this hat. Again, I just love this hat for the fact that I could essentially count all of these brushstrokes. You can tell it's done very wet into wet based on how this arcing brushstroke actually blends into the gray that's underneath. Same thing with like the feather detail around, actually don't know what this part of a hat is called, but right here you can see that this is actually working its way into whatever. Wow, I just really don't know the parts of a hat at all. That's what I've learned here. But you can see that this darker gray stroke is actually blending into the white that's adjacent to it. By contrast, you can actually tell that this is probably where the brushstroke was started, or that multiple brushstrokes started right around this area, because you have this very neat kind of pooling of paint that happens right along this edge, and you don't really see much in the way of blending here. And what's so great is that I can essentially look at the entirety of the hat and make similar assessments to understand how this was painted. Between the compression of the values and just how simply and elegantly this was done, both in the hat and the hands, I would say that's what really draws me to this piece. So I have my work cut out for me here. As I look at these two, both of these paintings have really beautiful aspects that draw me to them. I would say in this particular piece, it has so much to do with the color and the lost edges. The cat and the hand together on this suit, they're just really precious. I love the echoing of a lot of color in the face. But here, I'm just so incredibly drawn to the center of this painting, actually. This is something that to me reads a little bit more straightforward. The texture of the paint is really aligned with what I would like to learn from and practice myself. So I'm honestly curious to hear from you. I'm going to think about what I am going to decide to paint between these two images after this video goes live. But let me know in the comments if you have a favorite. And would you like to see me paint a specific portion of these paintings, essentially like cropping in? Would you like to see me embark on like a multi-day full-scale version of one of these pieces where I paint the entire thing and try to get it as accurate as possible? That would probably be a multi-part video series here on YouTube if I did that. And what is your preference between these two pieces? Which one would you like to see me paint and answer questions about so that you can learn from them? Let me know in the comments. And again, if you found this video really helpful and you want this kind of help in your own painting journey, let's say that you want to learn from Sargent's work as well, or you want to learn from Cecilia Beaux or Anders Zorn or Joaquín Sorolla, and you want help actually breaking down the exact steps that you would take in order to master these techniques and then start to apply them to your own original pieces, I would love to hear from you. All you need to do is check out the link in the description to find out more and book a call to see if we are a fit to work together. All right, until next time, I can't wait to read your comments and find out which of these paintings you would most like to see me create and answer questions about. And if you are looking to reach out, I look forward to speaking with you. Until then, happy painting.